So I welcome Hilary Beard.
Chris, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here to stand in front of you today. It was the fall of 2008, and I was out for a walk when my cell phone rang, and this gentleman, Phil Wilson, who's the president and CEO of an organization called the Black AIDS Institute, called me. I had known Phil for about 6 years, and he had been pivotal in helping me after I had made the decision to leave my corporate career to follow my dreams of becoming a writer. Phil actually enlisted me to become a writer who writes about HIV, to be an ally, to be an advocate for people who in that dimension of their life, in their health, have less privilege than I do. So Phil invited me to write a weekly newsletter for that organization, and I signed on because I wanted to be a better friend, a better advocate, a better ally, to use the bit of privilege that I have as a straight woman, as a woman who's upper middle class, as a woman who has a college education, as a woman who doesn't have HIV, to make space, perhaps, for somebody who does, to live a safer, healthier, more empowered life. So I signed on to work with Phil and to run this weekly newsletter. But the first opportunity I got to stand up and be that great ally, that great advocate, to be an activist, my feet felt as heavy as one of those 40-pound weights that you see in the gym. You see, my pastor, he did an altar call for us to pray for people living with HIV and AIDS. And I wanted to stand and I wanted to step forward. And I wanted to make space for somebody who doesn't share my privileges to feel safer, or perhaps to feel, to know that they should get tested, and know that somebody who's somewhat of a role model, somewhat of an advocate, who some people see as a successful person, would stand forward and stand for them. But as I stepped forward, as I walked forward, all these voices in my head were firing off. Who is she? What kind of person is she? I was wondering what people were thinking about me, and I was so ashamed at the things that I was wondering. Maybe I wasn't going to be such a great ally, an activist, an advocate. After all, I was running straight into the wall of my own biases that I didn't even know that I had. Bias. Such a scary word. It's such a scary word today. Where if you make a mistake, you wonder, what will people think of me? What might happen to me? Will some internet kook do something to harm me or people who care about me? But I was running straight into the wall of them, and I knew that I needed to grow. Psychologists and the neuroscience tells us that there are more than 120 different types of bias. And the fact of the matter is that I know intellectually that our bias just reflects the ways that our brain categorizes and sorts and makes sense and order out of a world that has too much information, that has so many things coming at us. It helps us become more efficient and effective in the world. But I was really ashamed of mine. There are many different cognitive types of bias. There's confirmation bias that causes us to value the confirmation of things that we already believe are true, and to devalue things that we don't think are true, even though the confirmation bias may actually mean that we're wrong. There's the bandwagon, jumping on the bandwagon, which is the thing that makes us think that buying a pet rock because everybody else is buying a pet rock, or following Kim Kardashian because other people are following Kim Kardashian, that actually makes it a good thing for us to do. There's the status quo bias that makes us value things the way that they are right now because we're afraid of what we might lose if we were to change things. And for example, there's the ostrich effect that may cause us to put our head into the sand, to ignore things and pretend like they aren't as bad as they are, when in fact, if we pulled our head out of the sand, we could make them better. Then there's my favorite kind of bias. It's called the Ikea Effect. I don't know if you guys have this issue, but I know that I do. What the Ikea Effect does is it causes us to value something more if we contributed to making it ourselves, whether or not the thing actually works. So if you're anything like me, maybe you have in your home that 3-drawer Ilska cabinet, like I do. The one that when I pulled the drawer open for the first time, proud that I, myself, had put it together, but then it started to lean, like Michael Jackson in Smooth Criminal. And I looked down and I saw that one remaining screw on the floor. That Ikea effect is also a bias. Am I the only person who's done this? So the fact of the matter is that the brain is constantly sensing our environment, trying to figure out who's in it, the identity, whether the people in our environment are the same identity as us, are they safe, are we safe? Though we think of our brain as a thinking machine, actually its number one job is to keep us safe. But sometimes the process of keeping us safe means that it tells us a lot of really crazy stories. I know my mind started to tell me a lot of stories when Phil invited me to attend the 2008 International AIDS Conference in Mexico City. It was a huge honor. He invited me to be part of a team of reporters. I would be a reporter. There were about 40 of us. We were going to report on the conference, the findings of 20,000 people, 20 to 30,000 people come to the International AIDS Conference every other year. It's the largest health conference in the world. People come from all over the world because AIDS is like climate change and water. It's one of those topics that the entire world comes together to solve. And so when I was at the International AIDS Conference, I found myself in a media room full of like all of humanity. I was sitting next to somebody from the Ukraine, across the table from somebody from Thailand. There were people from South Africa at my table, people from Uganda, somebody from Chile, all at the same table as me. These people were smart, they were intelligent, they were amazing writers. As a matter of fact, I was working being supervised by Linda Villarosa, who is a writer for the New York Times Magazine. She's written 2 stories for the New York Times Magazine. She's one of my mentors, and she was supervising and training me. So I was working with these really amazing people. I was also working for Phil, who is a gay black man who originally grew up in a low-income family, and Linda, who is one of the first African-American women to come out as lesbian. It was exciting to be in an environment where all my biases were being challenged, and I was growing and developing and learning. And at this conference, part of what I learned is that how if an ism or an obia doesn't cripple you, and it often does, as a matter of fact, maybe for many people, maybe it usually does, there are some people who come out the other side stronger. And so I watched Phil bring the conference to a halt when he exposed information about the United States' AIDS epidemic, when we're constantly wagging our finger at people from other parts of the world. He talked about how we were not walking the talk in some aspects of handling our AIDS epidemic in the United States. So it was a really empowering experience for me, and I had the opportunity to grow as an advocate and an ally, and to be in the presence of people who were different from me, or so I thought. I'd never met a sex worker. Then at the International AIDS Conference in Mexico City, I met a lot of them. I found out they're not so different from me. I liked a lot of them. I admired a lot of them. This was new information, and I wouldn't have considered myself as somebody who was biased. But the more I was exposed, the more I realized that I was. In 2010, Phil extended an invitation to me again. This time, not just to report, but to lead. So I led a team of about 20 journalists at that conference. And at that conference, I also found myself in the media room, but this time as a result of learning from being around new people and practicing being a better ally and practicing being an advocate and practicing being an activist, trying to find my voice. I actually found myself in the most important press conference in the entire conference, asking the most important question of that press conference, a question whose answer was then transmitted all over the world. I was growing in my activism and my allyship and becoming a less biased person as I walked into my fear of my bias and began to challenge it and explore it. In 2012, I was part of the delegation again leading, again about 20 people. At this point in time, I was growing and learning and challenging myself even more. And at this point in time, I started to be asked to lead in a different way. I had the opportunity not only to witness the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which is a quilt that represents 48,000 people who have lost their life to AIDS in the United States, and whose families have knit together, have sewn together, oftentimes by hand, quilt squares that represent their loved one's life. And so the AIDS Memorial Quilt ended up stretching almost all the way down the mall in Washington, D.C. But I also was invited to call some of their names. It was such an honor to know that I had walked through my fear, my biases, and I was using my privilege to use my voice to create a space for somebody who didn't have all the benefits and privileges that I did. It was a wonderful and a beautiful experience. In 2016, I was invited to Durban, South Africa. For the first time, I stuck my toes in the Indian Ocean, which was something that I didn't know that I hadn't even imagined doing before. But I knew I needed to grow some more. I knew I was biased against transgender people, and I didn't like it about myself. I was more and more ashamed. So I gave myself an assignment, and so the assignment was to cover a pre-conference to the International AIDS Conference. It was the Trans Empowered Conference, and for the first time in my life, rather than seeing transgender people from across the room or on the train or across the street, I was in the room with people who were willing to be kind to me, people who were willing to put up with my stupid questions, people who were willing to be patient with me, to share with me, and they broke my heart wide open. I listened to people talk about how their own parents bullied them from the time that they were 4 years old, and they never really understood why. I heard people talk about being kicked out of their own home when they were 9 years old and having to fend for themselves. I was so ashamed that I had once been somebody who laughed at transgender people. But I was proud of myself that I had done what I was supposed to do as a person who was becoming more empowered, more humane, more willing to own all of herself and to face the dark parts of herself so that she could come out free on the other side and advocate for people who needed protection sometimes, but who are capable of advocating for themselves if the world is safe for them. So I was honored to attend this conference, make friends who were transgender, and become more of the person who I'm supposed to be. Over these years, I've also made a lot of really, really wonderful friends, including my friend Phil, who now when we work together, people call us Hilary. But part of what I've learned is that by going and looking at the deepest, darkest parts of myself, the parts of myself that I was ashamed of, the parts of myself that I didn't want to admit that I had, the parts of myself that I wanted to gloss over, the parts that I wanted to pretend didn't exist, I found that when I looked in them, peeled them back, moved through them, challenged myself, was challenged, was called out, was corrected, and willing to stand in the face of that there was freedom on the other side of it, and some really amazing human beings who I would not have had the privilege of knowing and standing in for had I not been willing to challenge myself. So I'm telling you all a story of me, but I'm not really talking about myself. I'm using my story and some of my experiences to share a possibility for us. Because we in Philadelphia have some really intractable, long-standing problems that we've been facing that don't seem to be getting better. We're a very segregated community. Our poverty is just intractable. I was reading the article the other day that I'm sure many of you saw. How many of you saw the article about hunger in Philadelphia? Yeah, about how in so many places in the country it's getting better, but in Philadelphia it's actually gotten worse. We have a lot of issues here, and a lot of issues that we need to take on. And I want to invite us, like I suspect that if we're willing to look at our biases, look at our unconscious racial bias, look at the ways that we've internalized sexism, look at the ways that we've internalized a willingness to coexist alongside poverty, to look at our perhaps status quo bias that makes us think that if we keep things the way they are and and move forward incrementally, that things will get better in a world that's changing faster than any of us can keep up with. Maybe if we take a look at the ostrich effect, maybe in some areas where the problems don't seem to be moving or where they seem to be going backwards, if we pull our head out of the sand and just look at what is uncomfortable to us and that may seem ugly, if we look and examine our role in it, maybe we can make progress. If we consider that the possibility that we too experience the Ikea effect, and when institutions and structures and systems and processes that we've been involved in creating don't work, maybe if we examine our Ikea effect, we might be willing to make greater change. Philadelphia is a city that I love, and it contains amazing, amazing people. I hope by sharing these aspects of my life, I present a possibility for someone that perhaps by looking at the parts that are deep, by looking at our parts that are difficult, that by looking at the parts of us that may seem dark, that there could perhaps be freedom on the other side. Freedom not only for people who we may unintentionally harm by our unexamined bias, but maybe freedom for ourselves as well. So for instance, maybe somebody like me who was born in a middle-class family and has the privilege of an Ivy League college degree, maybe I'm not the person who's supposed to solve hunger, but maybe what I can do is open up a space for somebody who's maybe hungry, who maybe they are the person who's supposed to solve hunger because they've actually had the experience and have lived through it and have insights that somebody like me will never have. Maybe there's a child who's in poverty who has better answers to poverty than we do, or a child in an underfunded school where if we use our privilege, our power to make sure that their education is funded so that they get the type of education they deserve, maybe they'll solve poverty too, so that Philadelphia can truly be a place of freedom, brotherly love, and sisterly affection. Thank you.